They forced her to sit on the curb with her hands behind her head like a criminal, in the freezing cold, while they laughed and tore apart her belongings, all because she was black, driving a car they thought she shouldn't own. They didn't ask her name. They didn't ask where she was coming from. To them, she was guilty the moment they saw it. But what they didn't know was that the woman they humiliated was someone who outranked them in every way that truly mattered, and by the time they realized it, it was already too late. If stories like this matter to you, if you believe respect should never depend on skin color, stick around. Please like the video, subscribe if you haven't yet, and share in the comments. Where are you watching from, and what moment in this story hit you hardest? Toledo, Ohio, was the kind of town that fell asleep early. Past 10 o'clock, the streets turned silent, bathed only in the yellow pools of streetlights and the distant hum of a few stubborn vehicles still making their way home. It was a weeknight, cold and clear, and the familiar scent of wet asphalt lingered in the air. Officer Brett Dalton sat idly in his cruiser, parked along a sleepy stretch of Monroe Street, half listening to the dispatch radio crackle with minor disturbances from the far edges of town. It had been a slow shift, and boredom gnawed at the edges of his patience. He sipped from a styrofoam cup of coffee that had long since turned lukewarm, scrolling absent-mindedly through his phone when a sleek black vehicle came into view. The car caught his eye immediately, as a Cadillac CT5 VC Urus, its black paint gleaming even under the harsh streetlights. Brett's brows furrowed. It wasn't the car itself that bothered him, it was who was driving it. Behind the wheel, he caught a glimpse of a black woman, poised, sharply dressed, her posture suit confident for his liking. A quick, sharp thought flickered through his mind, unfiltered and poisonous. That car does. He chuckled under his breath, the sound low and humorless. Setting his coffee down, he reached for the overhead lights, flicking them on without a second thought. The red and blue strobes bathed the quiet street in urgency. He didn't have a real reason to stop her, not legally, not ethically. But something in him, something he didn't bother questioning, told him she needed checking out. "Let's see what we have here," Brett muttered to himself as he shifted the cruiser into gear and pulled out behind the Cadillac. Inside the black sedan, Lieutenant Colonel Gabrielle Morgan kept her eyes forward, her mind already halfway home. She had just completed a series of meetings 2 hours south of Toledo, dealing with military logistics and policy enforcement, a job that required precision, authority, and above all, restraint. The sudden flash of police lights in her rearview mirror made Gabrielle frown slightly. She wasn't speeding. She hadn't missed a light or crossed any lines. Still, years of experience had trained her to remain calm under pressure. She signaled, slowed, and pulled over onto the shoulder, her movements smooth and controlled. Gabrielle lowered her window halfway, placed both hands visibly on the steering wheel, and waited, every muscle in her body alert but composed. Brett approached the car, his flashlight beam slicing through the window, lingering far too long on her face before moving to scan the interior. "License and registration," he barked, the courtesy drained from his tone. Gabrielle kept her voice even, measured. "Officer, may I ask why your vehicle matches the description of a stolen car reported earlier?" He lied smoothly. There was no such report. Gabrielle, sensing the undercurrent of hostility, nodded once. She moved slowly, deliberately, reaching into her glove box for her registration and retrieving her license from her purse. As she handed them over, Brett took his time looking at her military ID tucked behind her driver's license. He barely glanced at it before snapping it back into the pile of documents. "Government issued. Huh, that's supposed to mean something?" he said, a sneer tugging at the corner of his mouth. Gabrielle remained silent, refusing to take the bait. She knew this dance all too well. Authority figures who saw only her skin and ignored the uniform she had spent decades earning. Brett circled the car, shining his flashlight on the pristine paint, the clean license plates, the government seal on the windshield. He found nothing, of course, but that only seemed to irritate him further. When he returned to the driver's window, his tone was clipped and commanding. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered. Gabrielle's heart rate quickened, but she showed no outward sign. "Is there a reason, officer?" she asked, her voice steady. Brett's eyes hardened. "Because I said so." And that was it. No lawful reason, no probable cause, just the bloated ego of a man who believed the badge gave him the right to do as he pleased. Gabrielle exhaled slowly through her nose. She knew her rights. She knew she could refuse. but she also knew how often refusal became resistance in reports like these. She reached for her phone, discreetly opening the camera app and hitting record, sliding the device into the console in clear view. Then, with the grace and calm that had carried her through war zones and command centers, she opened the door and stepped out into the cold night. Brett towered over her, flashlight angled to cast long shadows across her face. He didn't ask her to perform a sobriety test. He didn't mention any specific infraction. He simply enjoyed the display of control, however momentary. Gabrielle stood tall, shoulders squared, eyes cleared. Not defiant, just immovable. As the night deepened around them, the silence stretched taut, a battlefield of wills laid bare under the indifferent stars. Brett didn't realize it yet, but the moment he flicked on those lights, he hadn't just pulled over a driver. He had pulled over the very force that would unravel everything he thought he knew about power, justice, and consequence. Brett adjusted his belt and shifted his weight from one foot to the other, the beam of his flashlight still dancing unnecessarily across the Cadillac's glossy hood. He knew the longer he dragged this out, the more uncomfortable it would become, and some part of him, the part he usually kept buried under the armor of protocol, relished that. Gabrielle stood motionless beside her open door. The cold seeping through her, she kept her hands visible, her body language controlled, radiating a calmness that only seemed to antagonize Brett further. He leaned slightly closer to the window, tapping the license plate with his flashlight like a judge passing silent judgment. "This plate doesn't quite match the database," he said, his voice low and suspicious. Gabrielle tilted her head slightly, paying him respectfully but not submissive. "Officer, this vehicle is registered through federal government channels. The plate is issued directly from the Department of Defense." Brett made a show of squinting at the emblem near the plate, a small reflective seal that gleamed under the light, unmistakably authentic. Still, he grunted dismissively, as if seeing it for the first time but choosing not to believe his own eyes. "Anyone can slap a sticker on and make it look official these days," he muttered. He pulled out a small notepad from his breast pocket, scribbling something quickly, perhaps a plate number, perhaps nothing at all. It was a performance, one Gabrielle recognized instantly. She had seen it in other places, in other uniforms, where power and prejudice mixed like oil and water. She offered him her driver's license and registration, the papers crisp, organized, nothing out of order. On top of that, her military ID card rested, clean and impeccable. Brett took the documents without thanks, flipping through them with a kind of bored hostility. His eyes lingered longer than necessary on the government badge, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. "Military? Huh?" he said after a moment, the words dripping with skepticism. "That's what you're claiming." Gabrielle resisted the urge to roll her eyes. Instead, she nodded once, professional to the last fiber. "Yes, sir. Lieutenant Colonel Gabrielle Morgan, Army Reserve, assigned to the Department of Justice Military Liaison Program." Brett smirked, a hollow, humorless expression. "Big titles don't mean much out here on the streets," he said, thumbing through her paperwork again like he was searching for a flaw that wasn't there. His flashlight beam cut across her face once more, searching, accusing, looking for any sign of fear or guilt. He found none. Gabrielle's gaze was steady, her posture unshakable. Years of training had forged her into someone who did not crumble under scrutiny, a fact that only seemed to irritate him. Mind stepping over to the front of your vehicle for me?" he asked abruptly, snapping the papers back together and tucking them under his arm. Gabrielle didn't argue. She knew the script. Compliance first, questions later. She stepped forward, her heels clicking lightly on the asphalt, every movement composed and deliberate. Brett followed, close enough that his presence pressed against her personal space, a silent assertion of dominance. Under the sharp glare of the cruiser's headlights, she stood, facing forward, while Brett circled her car once again, muttering to himself where there were none. "Looks too clean," he said to nobody in particular, dragging his fingers lightly across the door as if expecting hidden fingerprints to leap out and confess. He stopped by the trunk and turned back toward Gabrielle. "This car's condition doesn't match the background information on it," he said, inventing concern where none existed. "Might be a mismatch. Could someone swap plates?" "Sir, the VIN number can verify ownership if needed." Brett narrowed his eyes, displeased that she wasn't rattled. "VINs can be forged too," he said, almost triumphantly, as if he'd caught her in some elaborate criminal conspiracy simply by existing. He pulled out his radio, pressing the button sharply. "Dispatch, this is Unit 237 requesting verification on vehicle VIN and plate crossmatch. Suspected possible forgery. Requesting backup for secondary verification." The response was a static crackle, followed by a bored voice. "Copy. Unit 237. Verification in progress. No current alerts on that vehicle. No active reports. Stand by." Brett clicked the radio off harder than necessary, frustration building behind his measured mask. He turned back toward Gabrielle, who had not moved an inch, her gaze unwavering. "Where are you headed tonight?" he demanded, shifting tactics. "Returning home from a military meeting in Columbus," Gabrielle answered crisply, offering no more information than necessary. Brett scoffed under his breath. "Lots of traffic between Columbus and Toledo this late, huh?" Gabrielle refused to rise to the bait. "Not typically, sir. That's why I scheduled my return after peak hours." Brett didn't respond immediately. He paced in front of the Cadillac like a restless predator, the tension between them growing heavier with each passing second. He tapped his flashlight against his thigh in a slow, rhythmic beat, thinking. She knew exactly what he was doing, searching, reaching, trying to manufacture probable cause where none existed. Finally, Brett stopped pacing and looked directly at her. "You're awfully composed for someone being questioned about a potential stolen vehicle," he said, letting the accusation hang thick in the air. Gabrielle met his gaze steadily. "I have nothing to hide, officer. I'm simply cooperating as required." Brett's jaw tightened again. He hated this, hated her poise, hated the mirror she unwittingly held up to him, reflecting every ounce of petty tyranny he was exercising. He hated it because deep down he knew he had nothing. No legitimate reason to detain her. No legal ground to escalate. Only his own festering bias and bruised authority. And yet something inside him refused to let go. He couldn't just wave her on her way now, not after asserting himself so heavily. His pride, battered and fragile, demanded he find something, anything to justify his behavior. He flicked his flashlight up again, pointing it casually at the rear seats. "Traveling alone?" he asked, though he could clearly see she was. "Yes, sir," Gabrielle replied, her patience thinning but still intact. Brett let out a long, deliberate sigh, the sound exaggerated, heavy with manufactured suspicion. He tapped the papers against his palm, thinking, calculating. There had to be a way to push this further without exposing how weak his case actually was. He wasn't ready to let her go. Not yet. Not until he forced her into some mistake, some crack in that armor of discipline she wore so flawlessly. Slowly, deliberately, Brett stepped closer to her, enough that Gabrielle had to tilt her chin up slightly to maintain eye contact. His voice dropped low, almost conspiratorial. "You know," he said, a smirk tugging at his lips, "some people go to a lot of trouble to make their stories look good on paper. Doesn't mean they're telling the truth." Gabrielle didn't blink, didn't flinch. She simply stood there, calm as stone, letting his words fall uselessly to the ground between them. Brett straightened up, tossing her documents onto the hood of the Cadillac with a careless flick of his wrist. "We're not done here," he muttered, stepping back toward his cruiser. As he disappeared into the harsh wash of his headlights, Gabrielle tightened her hands into fists at her sides, unseen in the shadows. She knew this wasn't over. She knew the real confrontation hadn't even begun. Brett's heavy boots crunched against the frosted pavement as he returned from his cruiser, a renewed purpose stiffening his stride. Gabrielle stood exactly where he had left her, framed by the biting glow of his headlights, the cold gnawing mercilessly at her exposed skin. She watched him approach, her heart rate steady, her breath plumbing in soft clouds around her face. Brett stopped 2 feet from her and tapped the side of his flashlight against his thigh rhythmically, a subtle warning, a message only he believed he was delivering. Without preamble, he jerked his chin toward the back of the Cadillac and said in a clipped tone, "Pop the trunk." Gabrielle blinked once, then carefully asked, her voice neutral, "May I ask the reason for that, officer?" Brett's smirk widened, predatory, as if savoring the moment. "Routine secondary inspection," he said, the words slipping off his tongue so easily, like he had rehearsed them 100 times before. Gabrielle hesitated only a fraction of a second, weighing her options, knowing full well that refusal could be twisted against her faster than a falling star. She moved to the driver's side, retrieved her keys from the ignition, and pressed the trunk release button. With a soft mechanical whine, the trunk lifted, revealing a neat, organized space. A duffel bag, a set of neatly folded uniforms, and a standard-ish emergency roadside kit. Gabrielle stepped aside, allowing Brett full access. But that wasn't enough for him. He crossed his arms over his chest, the flashlight tucked under one arm now as he barked, "I need everything out. Onto the curb, now." The words dropped like stones in the frozen air. Gabrielle's fingers tightened imperceptibly around her keys. She opened her mouth, chose her words extremely cold. Would it be possible to conduct the inspection without unloading all personal items onto the street? Brett laughed, a short, derisive sound that grated against the silence. "If you're clean, you shouldn't have a problem, should you?" he snapped. The implication was clear. Cooperation equaled innocence, hesitation equaled guilt. Gabrielle knew better. She knew that even perfect compliance could be twisted, recorded, framed against her depending on the whims of the officer in front of her. Still, refusing would hand him more ammunition. Suppressing a sigh, Gabrielle removed her gloves with slow, deliberate movements and began unloading the trunk. The duffel bag hit the curb with a muted thud, the roadside kit placed neatly beside it. The cold stung her fingers mercilessly, but she didn't flinch, didn't shiver. Brett loomed a few feet away, flashlight now aimed directly at her hands, scrutinizing her every move with the intensity of a prison guard watching for escape attempts. She knelt carefully, unzipped the duffel, and spread its contents for inspection. 2 changes of civilian clothes, a military folder containing documents related to her meeting, and a small toiletry kit. Brett circled slowly, dragging out the inspection like a cat toying with a mouse. He stooped to rifle through the clothing, deliberately careless, shaking out shirts and slacks like he expected contraband to fall from the fabric. "You travel light for someone with such important titles," Brett commented, his voice laced with mockery. Gabrielle did not respond. She knew the trap hidden in that casual tone. Responding would invite escalation, creating pretext. She remained silent, standing straight as the cold seeped into her bones. Brett moved to the roadside kit next, opening compartments, upending items onto the curb, flares, jumper cables, a first aid kit, yet he examined each piece like it was a clue in a criminal investigation, muttering nonsense under his breath. Gabrielle watched as a passing car slowed momentarily, the driver craning their necks to glimpse the scene, a black woman standing in the cold, her belongings scattered on the sidewalk under the supervision of a scowling, white officer. The humiliation burned under Gabrielle's skin, hot and violent, but she buried it deep. This wasn't new. This wasn't even surprising. She had lived too long and seen too much to expect fair treatment based solely on merit, on service, on honor. No, those things were invisible to men like Brett. All he saw was skin. All he respected was submission. Brett found nothing, of course. Nothing illegal, nothing suspicious. But instead of stepping back, instead of acknowledging that the stop should end there, he crouched down beside the duffel again and began thumbing through her military documents. Gabrielle took a half step forward, instinct tightening her muscles. But she froze before completing the motion. Interfering could be spun as resisting. She forced herself to remain still, every cell in her body screaming against the violation of her privacy, her dignity. Brett flipped open one folder, scanning the contents with an exaggerated show of ignorance, pretending not to understand the military jargon, the signatures, the official seals. "Big words," he said, glancing up at her. "You expect me to just take your word that all this is legit?" Gabrielle responded calmly, though the chill was now gnawing at her jaw, her breath fogging in short bursts. "All necessary verification codes are included in those documents. You can contact the Department of Justice Liaison Office if you require confirmation." Brett barked a short laugh. "Maybe I will. Maybe I'll hold you here until they answer." He straightened, kicking the roadside kit carelessly with his boot, sending a small medical pouch skittering across the pavement. Gabrielle said nothing, her fists clenched at her sides inside her coat pockets, her body locked in the same military stance she had been trained to maintain under enemy fire. Brett stood there, silhouetted against the blinding cruiser lights, breathing hard, frustrated that his fishing expedition had pulled up empty nets. The air between them was brittle, sharp enough to snap with the slightest wrong move. Brett tapped his flashlight against his thigh again, considering his next step, unwilling to relinquish the sense of control he had carved out so viciously. Gabrielle, still standing perfectly still, knew in her bones that the night was far from over, that this encounter was spiraling beyond mere humiliation towards something darker. She watched, silent and calculating, as Brett moved back toward the cruiser, his hand hovering near his belt, his mind no doubt working feverishly to find some other pretext, some other thin justification to extend the stop. He wasn't done yet. He couldn't be. His pride wouldn't let him. The cold bit harder as Gabrielle stood, motionless, watching Brett pace a tight circle near the scattered contents of her roadside kit. The seconds stretched long and brittle between them, each breath a thin plume in the frigid air. Brett stopped abruptly, his hand resting on his belt, his posture hardening into something cruel. His next words came out sharp, a barked order slicing through the night. "Sit down. Hands behind your head." For a split second, Gabrielle thought she had misheard him. She stared, expression blank, her mind racing through 1,000 calculations at once. She wasn't under arrest. She wasn't even being formally detained. Yet here he was, issuing orders reserved for criminals, for threats, for those stripped of dignity. Gabrielle knew better than to argue. The wrong word could turn the situation volatile faster than she could blink. Without protest, she lowered herself carefully onto the frozen pavement, the bite of the concrete seeping instantly through her clothes. Her knees protested the cold, her body stiffening against it. But she set her jaw and complied. She laced her fingers behind her head, elbows pointed outward, the universal posture of submission, of defeat, though inside her heart burned white-hot with restrained fury. Brett watched her settle, his lips curling into something dangerously close to satisfaction. The beam of his flashlight played lazily over her form, lingering far longer than necessary, as if marking a victory only he recognized. He didn't say anything immediately. Instead, he bent down, scooping up her phone from where it sat quietly on the curb, beside her duffel bag. Gabrielle's heart squeezed painfully in her chest. She knew that phones held personal messages, emails, and access to confidential government applications under tight security protocols. The idea of him thumbing through it, without warrant or cause, made her feel more violated than standing in the cold ever could. Brett turned the phone over in his hand like it was a toy, a casual prize. He pressed the home button. The screen lit up, the image of Gabrielle's ID photo background staring back at him. He murmured, loud enough for her to hear. "Nice setup you got here." Gabrielle ground her teeth together behind closed lips. She said nothing. Saying anything would only feed his narrative, give him reason to escalate further. She had to be smarter than that, had to be stronger. With her documents strewn carelessly nearby, her belongings rifled through, and her phone now in his hand, Brett strutted a few paces away from her, raising his radio to his mouth with a smug flick of his wrist. "Unit 28996, he said. 576216. Here. Female subject. Suspicious materials inside the vehicle and on her person." Requesting a secondary clearance unit, he paused, glancing over at Gabrielle, where she sat like a prisoner awaiting sentencing. Into the radio, he added with a chuckle, "Bet this girl's got something interesting in the car." The words hit Gabrielle harder than the cold. It wasn't enough that he had humiliated her physically. Now he was shaping the narrative, twisting reality in real time, laying the groundwork for whatever manufactured story he planned to submit later. Every false report he built tonight would stain her record, muddy her name, jeopardize her years of service. Unless she stayed smart, stayed calm, and documented everything she could. Brett began tapping through her phone, his fingers moving with the clumsy entitlement of someone who believed rules did not apply to him. Gabrielle could hear the faint beeps as he navigated through apps she hadn't authorized him to open, through contacts, messages, calendars. Every second he held that device felt like another layer of armor being stripped from her soul. Yet she didn't move. She didn't break posture. In that frozen posture of surrender, she still clung to her last line of defense. Witness everything, remember everything, survive everything. The headlights of passing cars occasionally painted the scene in ghostly sweeps of light, and Gabrielle wondered distantly whether anyone would think to stop, to question why a government-registered vehicle was pulled over on the side of the road, why a uniformed officer had forced a woman into the dirt like a criminal, without probable cause. But no one stopped. No one ever did. Injustice thrived best when it was quiet. When it was normalized, Brett muttered something under his breath, something she couldn't catch, then shoved the phone into his jacket pocket with the careless entitlement of a man pocketing a piece of discarded candy. He returned to the trunk, nudging through the few remaining items as if expecting a revelation to burst forth and vindicate his behavior. Gabrielle shifted slightly to keep her circulation moving, though the concrete burned against her skin now. More minutes crawled by. Brett circled back around her, crouching down slightly, his flashlight beamed directly in her eyes. "Funny thing," he said, voice low and oily. "People with nothing to hide usually don't mind a little inspection. You seem awfully stiff for someone who's supposedly innocent." Gabrielle said nothing. Every nerve screamed for her to say something, anything to call out the injustice, to demand her right, but she knew that if she gave him even the smallest flicker of resistance, it would be all the justification he needed. Brett leaned closer, invading her personal space, his breath visible between them in the frosty night air. "Got any surprises I should know about, Miss Big Shot?" he whispered. Gabrielle stared straight ahead, her fingers tightening slightly behind her head but otherwise giving no reaction. Brett snorted derisively, standing up and stepping back. Another voice crackled faintly from his radio, a second patrol car maybe 10 minutes away. Brett muttered a curse under his breath, annoyed at the delay. He wasn't ready for backup to arrive just yet. He wasn't done molding this situation to fit the story he wanted to tell. Gabrielle remained still, every muscle screaming from the cold, from the helplessness, from the knowledge that dignity meant nothing in moments like these. And Brett, feeling the seconds slip from his control, decided he needed more. Needed another angel. Needed to push harder. The minutes dragged out longer than Gabrielle could easily track, each second punctuated only by the harsh breath of the cold wind and the occasional hiss of static from Brett's radio. She remained seated on the freezing concrete, her body aching from the posture she was forced to maintain, her fingers now stinging with a numbness that bordered on danger. Brett loomed nearby, pretending to continue his so-called inspection, although it was clear even to the most casual observer that he was merely biding time, trying to conjure a justification for what he had already done. Gabrielle's mind sharpened under the cold and the insult, cataloging every violation, every unlawful search, every humiliation being heaped upon her. The flashing blue and red lights from Brett's cruiser bathed the entire stretch of Monroe Street in an artificial, jarring glow. That visual warning must have caught the attention of Officer Ethan Price, who pulled up behind Brett's cruiser with a lazy swing of his steering wheel, his own siren whooping briefly before cutting off. His squad car door slammed with a casual thud as he sauntered across the street, a figure of exaggerated confidence in the dark. Gabrielle did not move, her body locked in that forced position of supposed submission, but her eyes tracked every step Ethan made toward Brett. Ethan was younger than Brett, leaner, his uniform fitting a little too neatly as if he had something to prove. His hand rested lightly on his belt as he approached, his flashlight swinging in slow arcs as he surveyed his eyes landed first on the scattered belongings still lying on the curb, then on the government-issued Cadillac, then finally on Gabrielle herself. His lips twitched into a smirk almost immediately. "Well, what do we have here?" Ethan drawled, his voice loud enough to carry over the cold night air. He cocked his head slightly, sizing Gabrielle up like a piece of livestock at an auction. Brett didn't bother hiding his grin. "She's military, supposedly," he said, jerking his thumb at Gabrielle like she was nothing more than a misplaced item. Ethan let out a low whistle, stepping closer to the Cadillac and running his gloved hand across the polished surface of the trunk. "Military ride, huh?" he mused, tapping the trunk lightly. Then, with a smirk that was all teeth and contempt, he added, "Probably some rich boyfriend's car she borrowed." The words weren't even cloaked in professionalism. They were meant to sting, meant to provoke, and for a brief moment Gabrielle felt the urge to lift her head, to meet his gaze with the full force of her indignation. But she resisted. She stayed perfectly still, absorbing the insult like a rock absorbs the battering of waves. Neither Brett nor Ethan bothered addressing her directly anymore. They talked around her, over her, like she wasn't even there. "You think she's gonna cry or pull the 'do you know who I am' card?" Ethan chuckled, nudging Brett with his elbow. Brett laughed in return, a low, ugly sound that vibrated in the stillness. "Maybe both," he said. "But don't worry, we'll get something real out of her soon enough." The malice in his tone was unmistakable, yet it was layered under the casual ease of men who believed the world would never hold them accountable. Gabrielle stayed frozen, the cold now sinking deep into her joints, her muscles cramping painfully. She had been held there for at least 40 minutes by now, with no Miranda rights read, no probable cause declared. Every legal instinct in her screamed at the violations stacking up minute. In another life, in another setting, she would have demanded counsel, filed grievances, threatened lawsuits. But here, on this lonely stretch of road, with two armed officers whose disdain for her was visible in every word, every gesture, survival dictated silence and stillness. Ethan squatted next to Gabrielle, tilting his head to catch her eye, as if examining a strange, mute creature. "You know," he said conversationally, "if you're so innocent, why all the nerves?" Gabrielle said nothing, her gaze locked on some distant, invisible point beyond the streetlights. Ethan chuckled again. "Classic, guilty behavior," he pronounced to Brett, standing back up and dusting off his knees like he had accomplished something meaningful. Brett stepped forward then, pulling the phone from his jacket pocket, waving it lightly in the air. "Got herself locked down pretty tight," he said, half to Ethan, half to himself. "But I'll bet there's something interesting buried deep in here. Messages, maybe. Pictures." He spoke as if Gabrielle were deaf, as if the mere fact of her silence justified his assumptions. Ethan nodded approvingly, his breath visible in short, sharp puffs behind. "They hide all kinds of stuff behind fancy jobs and clean cars," he said. "You'd be surprised how many respectable types are just as dirty as the rest." Gabrielle felt a fresh wave of nausea roll through her, not from fear, but from a profound sense of betrayal. Not personal betrayal. She had never expected men like them to see her humanity, but betrayal of the ideals they claimed to represent, the law they were sworn to uphold. Every second they continued this charade eroded not just their dignity, but the foundation of trust the entire system was supposed to rest upon. Brett finally looked back at her, tilting his head slightly as if reconsidering. "Maybe we ought to hold her a little longer," he mused. "Make sure we're thorough. Don't want to miss anything important." Ethan grinned wide, already complicit. "After all," he said, "she's the one who decided to make this difficult." The cold gnawed deeper into Gabrielle's bones, and still she didn't move. 40 minutes of degradation and counting, 40 minutes of unlawful detention, 40 minutes of insults, illegal searches, and calculated cruelty disguised as procedure. The real question now wasn't whether they would find anything incriminating. It was how far they were willing to go to manufacture something, and Brett, emboldened by Ethan's presence, by the dark and the silence and the absence of witnesses, was already considering his next move. The cold pressed in closer, tightening its invisible grip around Gabrielle's shoulders as she knelt stiffly by the curb, her body aching from the relentless posture forced upon her for the past hour. Brett stood several feet away, his figure outlined by the rotating glare of the patrol lights, talking in low tones with Officer Ethan Price. Their laughter, casual and coarse, floated across the frozen air like an additional slap to her dignity. The two men, emboldened by their mutual contempt, seemed to feed off each other's cruelty, escalating the situation with an almost juvenile glee. Brett suddenly broke away from the conversation, striding back toward the Cadillac with an exaggerated swagger, flashlight drawn once more as if he were preparing to unearth some grand piece of evidence. He circled the vehicle slowly, dragging the beam of light across the glossy black surface with theatrical thoroughness. Gabrielle tracked him silently, her heart steady but her stomach knotting in anticipation. She knew the pattern by now. When men like Brett couldn't find real wrongdoing, they invented it. He reached the rear left fender, paused, and leaned in closer, his breath misting against the paint. With exaggerated slowness, he placed his gloved fingers against a faint, almost invisible scratch, something that could have easily been picked up from any parking lot, something utterly inconsequential. Brett straightened and tapped his radio, his voice suddenly pitched louder, meant to travel beyond just Ethan's ears. "Dispatch, Unit 2737 said, possible evidence of forced entry located on the vehicle. Minor surface damage consistent with tampering." Gabrielle's spine stiffened. It was a lie, transparent and clumsy, but Brett spoke it with the casual confidence of someone who expected no challenge. Brett turned, meeting Ethan's amused smirk, and added for good measure, "Looks like we just stopped a high-end car theft operation." The words hung in the night air like a dirty flag. Gabrielle's fists clenched reflexively behind her head. She inhaled deeply, forcing herself to remain still, to not react visibly to the provocation. She knew every camera on their bodies, assuming their body cams were even turned on, would capture only what Brett and Ethan wanted captured. She had no illusions about the narrative they were crafting for the official report. Brett leaned against the Cadillac now, his posture lazy, self-satisfied. He flicked his flashlight at Ethan, who chuckled and shook his head like the two of them had just shared a private joke at Gabrielle's expense. Ethan strolled closer to Gabrielle, his boots crunching softly on the icy pavement. "You hear that, lady?" he drawled. "Looks like you got some explaining to do. Maybe we should run a full background check, wouldn't want it." Gabrielle remained silent, her eyes fixed on the cracked asphalt beneath her. Every second she spent there, every lie spoken over the radio, every false accusation lodged felt like an iron brand searing into her skin. But she stayed composed. She knew better than anyone that the first one to lose composure would be the first one labeled guilty. Brett tapped his radio again, pretending to listen to a fabricated response. "Affirmative," he said loudly. "Proceeding with detainment for further questioning." His tone was smug, dripping with triumph. He wasn't just trying to intimidate Gabrielle now. He was putting on a performance for any dispatchers or patrol cars within earshot. It was a show of dominance wrapped in the flimsy shroud of procedure. From his position at the rear of the Cadillac, Brett gestures broadly at the faint scratch as if revealing some grand piece of evidence to the invisible jury watching from the shadows. "You see?" he said to Ethan, not bothering to lower his voice. "People who steal high-end government vehicles usually aren't too careful about how they handle them. Scratch marks like these? Dead giveaway." Ethan laughed loud and sharp, the dead game. "Maybe she thought a fancy plate would cover the tracks," he said, jabbing his thumb toward Gabrielle. "But once a crook, always a crook." Gabrielle's heart pounded in her chest, not from fear, but from the sheer rage of helplessness. She had spent decades serving a country that allowed moments like this to happen unchecked, moments where uniformed men with badges and guns rewrote reality on a whim because they could. The radio crackled again, a faint reminder that somewhere beyond this frozen theater, the wider world still spun. Brett spoke into it casually. "Holding suspects for further vehicle inspection," he said. "Possible federal involvement. Will advise." His eyes gleamed as he said it, savoring the drama, the escalation. Federal involvement. As if Gabrielle herself wasn't a federal officer, as if her own credentials hadn't been summarily dismissed the moment he saw her skin. Brett finally turned back toward Gabrielle, sauntering up to her with a mockingly paternal smile. "Now," he said, crouching so they were nearly eye to eye, "you want to tell me how a scratch like that ended up on a nice, clean government Cadillac, huh? Someone got rough with you, or were you just in a hurry to get away?" Gabrielle didn't blink, didn't breathe harder, didn't give him an inch. She knew any sign of emotion would be twisted, exaggerated, and weaponized. She let the silence stretch long enough that even Brett's smugness wavered slightly. He rose with a grunt, brushing imaginary dust from his knees. "Suit yourself," he muttered. "You'll have plenty of time to explain it downtown." The word downtown twisted sharply in Gabrielle's gut. She had to keep her focus, had to endure this theater a little longer, because she knew the tide could only turn if she didn't give them a single thread to pull against her. Ethan leaned casually against his cruiser now, arms folded, watching the scene unfold with the lazy indifference of someone sure he was on the winning side. Gabrielle breathed slowly, evenly, centering herself against the rising tide of outrage. Because Brett wasn't finished yet, not even close. Gabrielle sat still, the frozen concrete gnawing relentlessly at her knees, but her mind remained razor-sharp despite the cold, the insults, the suffocating weight of injustice pressing down on her. She had endured the humiliation, cataloged every illegal search, every fabricated charge, every moment Brett and Ethan had twisted the law into a weapon against her. And yet, even as her body screamed in protest, she had waited, watching for the exact moment to strike back. Not with anger, not with defiance, but with precision. Brett still strutted near the Cadillac, waving his flashlight lazily, pretending to inspect the faint scratch that he had already broadcast over the radio as evidence of a grand theft operation. Ethan leaned casually against his own cruiser, arms crossed, a lazy smile playing on his lips as he watched Brett conduct his one-man show. Gabrielle knew that if she moved too soon, it would be twisted as aggression. If she spoke too loudly, it would be recorded as hostility. But now, as Brett bent over to run his fingers yet again along the unremarkable surface of her car, she knew the timing was right. Slowly, carefully, she shifted her weight, rising to her feet with the mechanical stiffness of someone who had been held too long in one position. Brett's head snapped toward her instantly, the flashlight beam slicing across her face. "Stay where you are," he barked, the command sharp and automatic. Gabrielle did not argue. She did not flinch. Instead, she moved with deliberate precision, her right hand slipping into the inner pocket of her jacket, retrieving a slim, leather-bound wallet no larger than her palm. She held it out in front of her, offering it wordlessly, letting the simple, silent gesture undercut every ounce of Brett's manufactured authority. Brett hesitated, a frown pulling at the corners of his mouth as he stalked over and snatched the wallet from her hand. He flipped it open with a jerk, the beam of his flashlight illuminating the contents. The military ID stared back at him, unimpeachable and official, the golden eagle insignia of the United States Army embossed over her photograph and details. Name: Gabrielle Morgan. Rank: Lieutenant Colonel. Department: Department of Justice Military Liaison Office, Civil Rights Investigation. Brett's smirk faltered, the corners of his mouth twitching with uncertainty as he scanned the credentials again, as if hoping he had misread them the first time. He hadn't. The seal was real. The clearance codes were real. And more damning than anything else, the authority behind the card was really an authority far above his own. Gabrielle remained silent, her face composed, offering him no explanation, no plea. She didn't need to. The weight of the truth sat between them now, heavier than any accusation Brett could have fabricated. Behind him, Ethan straightened slightly, his arms unfolding from his chest, the lazy grin slipping from his face as the reality of what they had done began to sink in. Brett turned away sharply, muttering under his breath, thumbing the radio at his shoulder with hands that trembled slightly now, though he tried to mask it. "Dispatch, Unit 232, he said, his voice tighter than before. "Requesting immediate supervisor contact. Possible situation escalation involving federal personnel." The response came back faster than either man expected, the dispatcher's voice crisp, almost sharp with authority. "Unit 237, confirm the subject's identification." Brett cleared his throat. "Lieutenant Colonel Gabrielle Morgan, DH Military Liaison Office, badge number." He rattled off the number from her ID, his voice losing steam with every syllable. There was a pause on the other end, a heavy, charged silence, before the dispatcher replied, "Hold position. Do not engage further. Supervisor en route. All further action suspended pending review." Brett's face darkened visibly under the flashing patrol lights. His radio crackled again a moment later, this time with a voice Brett recognized immediately, the voice of Captain Harris, his direct commanding officer. "Dalton, Price, stand down immediately. Cease all interaction with the subject. Collect reports. Prepare for internal review. Potential legal action pending." The words hit like bullets, each syllable stripping away layers of the arrogant armor Brett had worn all night. He lowered the radio slowly, the hand that held Gabrielle's ID now shaking visibly despite the freezing air. Ethan shifted uncomfortably by his cruiser, no longer smirking, no longer at ease. The silence between the three of them stretched thin and brittle, ready to snap at any moment. Gabrielle watched it all unfold but inside her heart pounded not with fear, not with anger, but with grim vindication. The system had noticed, finally, belatedly, but undeniably. It had noticed. She had not needed to raise her voice, had not needed to match their hostility with her own. She had needed only the truth and the patience to wield it at exactly the right moment. Brett handed the ID back to her awkwardly, not meeting her eyes, mumbling something incoherent that could barely pass for an apology. Gabrielle took the wallet with steady hands, sliding it back into her jacket without a word. There was nothing more to say. The facts spoke louder than any protest she could have made. Ethan muttered a curse under his breath, stepping away from the scene, his bravado evaporating like mist under the rising sun. Brett busied himself gathering the scattered papers and belongings he had so carelessly strewn about earlier, his movements jerky and inefficient. Neither man dared say anything further. They couldn't. Their authority, their illusion of superiority had been shattered in front of their own eyes. Gabrielle stood silently beside her car, her breath misting in the cold, waiting as the distant sound of another cruiser approached from down the street. Reinforcements were coming, not to back up Brett and Ethan, but to witness the aftermath of their choices, to document their misconduct, to begin the long, slow process of accountability. And Gabrielle, calm and unmoving, prepared herself for what came next. Gabrielle stood motionless for a moment longer, letting the cold air seep into every fiber of her body, not from weakness, but as a final act of control over herself. She could have spoken. She could have demanded apologies, explanations, retribution. But she chose silence, a weapon sharper than any words she could have hurled at the two men shrinking before her. Without a glance toward Brett or Ethan, she bent down with military precision, her movements fluid and unhurried as she began collecting her scattered belongings, her duffel bag, her emergency kit, her carefully organized files, all handled with the same calm dignity that she had maintained throughout the entire ordeal. Ethan shifted awkwardly near his cruiser, hands fidgeting uselessly at his belt as if searching for something to anchor himself. Brett busied himself scribbling nonsense in his notepad, anything to avoid meeting her gaze. The authority that once radiated from him, bloated and unchecked, had shriveled under the cold glare of truth. Gabrielle checked her documents methodically, ensuring nothing was missing or damaged before loading them back into her trunk. Every movement was deliberate, sending a clear, wordless message. You no longer control this. She closed the trunk with a soft thud, stepped smoothly into the driver's seat, and started the engine. The Cadillac's soft purr filled the silent street, cutting through the brittle air like a blade. For a brief moment, she sat there, staring ahead through the windshield, her hands steady on the wheel, her mind already moving beyond this night toward the battle ahead. Then, without hesitation, she pulled away from the curb, the black sedan gliding back onto Monroe Street and disappearing into the night. Brett watched the taillights recede into the darkness, a sick knot twisting tighter in his gut. The adrenaline that had carried him through his performance earlier was gone now, replaced by a gnawing unease he couldn't shake. He told himself he had done nothing wrong, that he had only followed protocol, that any fallout would be a simple misunderstanding easily smoothed over. But deep down, beneath the defensive rationalities he clung to, Brett knew better. He knew what he had seen in Gabrielle's ID. He knew what he had heard from the dispatcher's voice and Captain Harris's icy command. And he knew that what had just transpired was no longer contained to the shadows of an empty street. Ethan wandered back over, breaking the heavy silence. Man, that was a mess, he muttered, not meeting Brett's eyes. Brett said nothing. There was nothing to say. He jerked his chin toward the paperwork scattered on the hood of his cruiser. Get it cleaned up, he barked, his voice raw with frustration. Ethan muttered an acknowledgement and set to work, but the energy had drained from him, his cocky swagger replaced by a subdued efficiency. Brett sat heavily in the driver's seat of his cruiser, the door creaking under the sudden movement. He stared at the dashboard blankly, the flashing lights now feeling more like an accusation than a warning. He reached for his onboard computer, pulling up the incident log, mechanically filling out the preliminary details. Each keystroke felt heavier than the last. Traffic stop initiated, suspicious behavior observed, routine search conducted. The lies built themselves almost instinctively, brick by brick, a wall against the consequences he could already feel looming. Still, some part of him, desperate and clinging to old habits, convinced him that if he got ahead of the paperwork, if he controlled the narrative early enough, he might still walk away clean. He submitted the initial report, leaning back with a Silas nervously. Stewing up at the building cell show could offer him protection from what was coming. Then he checked his department email, more out of habit than real concern. The new message notification blinked at him like a silent alarm. He clicked it open. The email was brief, cold, and devastating in its simplicity. Subject: mandatory appearance notification. Sender: Internal Affairs Division. Body: Sergeant Brett Dalton. You are hereby ordered to appear before the Toledo Municipal Court within 72 hours to respond to formal charges of abuse of authority, unlawful detainment, violation of civil rights under color of law, and racial profiling during incidents. Failure to comply will result in immediate suspension without pay and further disciplinary action. Attached was a PDF file, an official summons from the court, complete with a time-stamped electronic signature. Brett's stomach dropped as he scanned the document, his fingers trembling slightly. It wasn't a warning. His mind reeled, grasping for a foothold, a lifeline, anything to slow the spiral. But there was nothing. The truth had already been set free. He cursed under his breath, shoving his chair back from the console so hard that it rattled the frame of the cruiser. Ethan poked his head in from the passenger side, eyes wide and wary. "Something wrong?" he asked cautiously. Brett glared at him, the temptation to lash out sharp and immediate, but he forced it down. "Nothing," he snapped. "Just clean up your damn report and keep your mouth shut." Ethan retreated without another word, his expression unreadable. Brett rubbed his hands over his face, the cold seeping into his bones now in a way that had nothing to do with the weather. He thought about Gabrielle, the way she had stood there without fear, without rage, letting the weight of her authority settle around her like armor. He thought about the moment he had seen her ID, the sickening realization that he wasn't the one in control. And he thought about the court date now hanging over him like a guillotine. For the first time that night, Brett felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not anger, not irritation, but genuine fear. Not the fear of losing his job or facing public scrutiny, though those things loomed large enough. It was the deeper fear, the fear that he had crossed a line he could never uncross, that all the excuses and justifications he had relied on would not save him this time. Because this time, someone had been watching, someone with the power to hold him accountable, someone who had chosen not to fight fire with fire, but with truth. And Brett, in all his arrogance, had handed her every weapon she needed. The courthouse of Toledo stood stern and imposing against the gray morning sky, its stone facade pitted and scarred by decades of wind and rain, as if it bore physical testimony to the battles for justice fought within its walls. Gabrielle Morgan stood on the steps in full civilian attire, her posture as straight as if she were still in uniform, her expression calm, unreadable. Inside, the hum of muted conversation and the occasional shuffle of legal papers filled the air, a solemn orchestra of bureaucracy preparing for another trial. But today was different. Today, the trial was not about petty crime or minor infractions. Today was about truth, power, and the line that had been crossed by those sworn to protect it. Brett Dalton sat rigidly at the defendant's table, his uniform exchanged for a simple gray suit that did little to hide the sweat beating at his temples. His lawyer whispered urgently in his ear, but Brett barely heard him, his mind replaying the past week like a bad dream on an endless loop. The summons, the internal review, the defense that felt thinner and more desperate with every passing day. Across the courtroom, Gabrielle sat with her attorney, composed and unflinching, a quiet force of nature that seemed to shrink Brett further into his seat. The bailiff called the court to order, and the proceedings began. Opening statements were brief, sharp, and surgical. Gabrielle's attorney laid out the case with brutal clarity: an unlawful traffic stop, fabricated probable cause, unauthorized. Brett's attorney countered with vague claims about officer safety and the need for discretion during nighttime stops. But the words felt hollow, the arguments brittle against the mounting evidence. The first true hammer blow came when the prosecution introduced the security footage from nearby traffic cameras. The room darkened, and on the large monitor set up for the jury, the events of that cold night unfolded with chilling clarity. There was no erratic driving, no suspicious behavior. Gabrielle's car moved smoothly and legally through the quiet streets. Brett's cruiser appeared, trailing her for several blocks before initiating the stop without provocation. The footage showed Gabrielle pulling over calmly, Brett approaching aggressively, showing Gabrielle complying at every turn, while Brett escalated unnecessarily. The jury watched in silence as the footage continued, Brett ordering Gabrielle out of the car, forcing her to sit on the frozen curb, rifling through her belongings without consent. They heard the audio clips where Brett and Ethan mocked her, where Brett lied over the radio about evidence of theft, where Ethan joked about her needing a rich boyfriend to afford her car. They saw Brett examining the barely visible scratch on the Cadillac and then fabricating an elaborate narrative around it. They listened to Brett invent probable cause with casual malice, building a case not from facts, but from bias and arrogance. Gabrielle's attorney played each clip methodically, giving the jury no room to escape the reality unfolding before them. Every minute of humiliation, every violation of Gabrielle's rights, every abuse of power was laid bare under the sterile lights of the courtroom. When the video of Gabrielle presenting her ID appeared, the moment Brett realized who he had detained, the shift in the courtroom was almost physical. Even some of the jurors visibly stiffened, their faces hardening as they recognized the gravity of what had occurred. Brett sat frozen, his hands gripping the edge of the defendant's table so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His lawyer tried to mount objections, citing context, citing officer discretion, but the objection sounded desperate and hollow against the visual, undeniable proof that played out again and again on the screen. When the final clip ended, the lights came back up, and the prosecution rested its case without further fanfare. They didn't need emotional appeals. The truth was enough. Brett's defense attempted a half-hearted rebuttal, claiming that the nighttime conditions justified heightened caution, that the behavior observed was ambiguous. But no one in the room truly believed it, not the judge, not the jury, not even the handful of local officers who had come to observe the proceedings. When closing arguments concluded, the jury was given their instructions and retired to deliberate. They returned less than 2 hours later. The courtroom rose as the judge took his seat. Brett remained seated until his lawyer tugged at his sleeve, and even then he moved like a man facing his own execution. The jury foreperson, a woman in her late 40s with sharp eyes and a firm voice, stood and read the verdict clearly. We, the jury, find the defendant, Sergeant Brett Dalton, liable for unlawful detainment, abuse of color. The words struck like hammers. Brett closed his eyes briefly, a long, slow exhale escaping him. The judge nodded gravely, turned to Brett and spoke in a voice heavy with the weight of the decision. Sergeant Dalton, the actions you took on the night in question constitute a gross violation of your duty as a law enforcement officer. You are hereby terminated from the police department, effective immediately. The judge continued, his tone unwavering. Furthermore, you are ordered to pay damages to Lieutenant Colonel Gabrielle Morgan in the amount of $120,000 for emotional distress, unlawful treatment, and reputational harm, as well as cover all legal fees incurred by the plaintiff. Gabrielle did not smile. She did not celebrate. She accepted the judgment with the same calm dignity she had displayed since the beginning. To her, this was not a victory to gloat over. It was merely the restoration of truth, the correction of a wrong that should never have been committed. Brett slumped visibly in his seat, his world collapsing around him as the reality of the consequences settled like a lead weight on his shoulders. The judge concluded with a final pointed remark. Power without accountability is tyranny. Today, this court affirms that those who wield power are not beyond the reach of justice. The courtroom began to stir with murmurs and shifting bodies as the judge stood and exited through the heavy oak doors. Gabrielle gathered her belongings quietly, her every movement deliberate and measured. Around her, the faces of the jury, the spectators, even the bailiffs reflected a spectrum of emotions, relief, satisfaction, and for some, a sobering reminder of the cost of unchecked authority. But for Gabrielle, there was no triumph. There was only the next step. The courtroom had mostly emptied, leaving only a few lingering figures lost in the aftershock of the verdict. Brett remained seated, his body slumped forward, the finality of the judge's ruling pressing down on him like an immovable weight. For a long moment he simply sat there, numb, staring at the polished wood of the defendant's table. Then, slowly, as if something deep and long buried finally cracked open inside him, Brett's shoulders began to... A few murmured conversations nearby died away as people turned subtly to watch. Brett lifted one trembling hand to his face, wiping futilely at the tears that slipped past his defenses, his breath catching in short, sharp gasps. "I have," Brett said, voice hoarse and broken, rising just enough for the few remaining spectators to hear. "I have let hatred and prejudice destroy everything I built." His words hung in the heavy air, raw and unfiltered, a confession not made under legal duress but from the crumbling ruins of his own conscience. Brett's lawyer placed a cautious hand on his back, offering some small measure of comfort, but Brett barely noticed. Across the room, Gabrielle observed him without judgment. She did not revel in his collapse, nor did she turn away. She simply acknowledged it as another necessary part of the truth coming to light. The weeks following the trial were a blur of headlines, departmental memos, and public outcry. Brett's name appeared in articles, in debates, in committee meetings about law enforcement reform. His disgrace was public and painful, a cautionary tale in the city he had once patrolled with unchecked authority. Yet somewhere amid the chaos, something unexpected happened. Stripped of his badge, his title, and the illusions he had clung to for years, Brett found himself forced to confront the man he had become next. 1 year later, the auditorium at the Toledo Police Academy was filled with the hum of new recruits. The young men and women sat straight-backed in their chairs, their crisp uniforms still stiff with newness, their faces eager but nervous. At the front of the room, a man approached the podium, his presence subdued but steady. Brett Dalton adjusted the microphone with a practiced hand, cleared his throat, and began to speak. "I used to believe that the badge gave me authority," Brett said, his voice even but carrying the weight of hard-earned experience. "I thought it meant control, respect, fear. I thought it insulated me from consequences. I was wrong." The recruits listened intently, some exchanging glances, unsure of what to make of a former officer who stood before them not as a hero, but as a warning. Brett continued, "A year ago I stood in a courtroom, stripped of my uniform, stripped of my pride. I had allowed my biases, my assumptions, and my unchecked power to harm someone who deserved respect, not suspicion. That failure didn't just cost me my career, it almost cost me my soul." He paused, scanning the faces in the crowd. "You're here because you want to serve," he said. "Remember this, service isn't about domination, it's about protection. Power without compassion is just cruelty dressed in a uniform." The words hit harder than any disciplinary lecture or textbook definition. They came from a man who had lived the consequences and emerged scarred but awake. Brett spent the next hour leading a mandatory workshop titled Bias Recognition, walking the recruits through scenarios, self-assessments, and hard conversations most departments had once conveniently ignored. It was uncomfortable, difficult work but necessary. Meanwhile, across the city, Gabrielle Morgan continued her own quiet mission. She declined every interview request, every media appearance, every opportunity to turn her personal ordeal into a public spectacle. Instead, she partnered with local leaders, advocacy groups, and reform-minded officials to build new frameworks for accountability within the police system. She helped design citizen oversight committees, authored proposals for mandatory cultural sensitivity training, and advocated fiercely for body camera reforms that would prevent situations like hers from being buried or rewritten. Gabrielle understood better than most that real change was slow, grinding work that rarely made headlines. But she didn't care about attention, and she cared about results, about ensuring that future traffic stops didn't end in humiliation, or worse, simply because of a driver's skin color. She attended every city council meeting concerning police reform, quietly offering expertise and support. Her presence became a constant, a steady reminder that vigilance was necessary, that progress required persistence. One evening, as Gabrielle reviewed draft legislation in her modest office overlooking downtown Toledo, an email notification pinged softly on her laptop. It was a forwarded message from the Academy director, a summary of the latest anti-bias training programs. Attached was a short video clip. Curiosity piqued. Curiosity there, grainy but unmistakable, was Brett Dalton standing at the front of a classroom, speaking candidly to a room full of recruits about the dangers of unchecked authority. Gabrielle watched in silence, absorbing every word. She noted the tension in his posture, the vulnerability etched into his voice. It was not an absolution, not for her, not for him, but it was a beginning, a step forward. She closed the laptop gently, leaning back in her chair as the city lights flickered to life beyond the window. Change was rarely loud. It didn't always come with grand speeches or viral moments. Sometimes, it came in the form of a disgraced officer choosing humility over bitterness. Sometimes it came through a woman who refused to let injustice silence her. And sometimes, if you were lucky enough to see it, it came like this: a slow, stubborn blooming in the cold, unforgiving soil of hard truth. Gabrielle smiled faintly to herself, not in quiet satisfaction. There was still much to do, much to fight for. But for tonight, she allowed herself a moment of peace. Because sometimes, against all odds, people could change. Systems could bend toward justice, and dignity, once stripped away, could be reclaimed not with violence, but with unwavering strength. If you're still here, thank you for following this story all the way through. If you enjoyed the journey, make sure to hit that subscribe button and leave a like. It really helps more stories like this reach people who care. I'm curious, which moment in Gabrielle's story hit you the hardest, and where are you watching from today? Drop a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts.